19 years of existence amounted to the price of a single, sway-backed heifer. Dust choked the air of the Higgins farm that sweltering August afternoon in 1874, when Clara watched her father shake hands with a man who smelled of stale whiskey and cruelty. Amos Gentry didn't want a wife. He wanted property. Traded like livestock, Clara was thrown over the back of a roan gelding, destined for a life of brutal servitude. But destiny has a funny way of shifting in the untamed Colorado Rockies, especially when a rugged, silent trapper named Gideon Cole crosses your path. The drought of '74 had baked the soil of Olathe, Colorado, into a cracked, unforgiving crust. For the Higgins family, starvation wasn't a distant threat. It was a daily companion that sat with them at their empty wooden dining table. Clara Higgins, 19 years old, with hands calloused from years of pulling dead roots from dead earth, knew her father, Jebediah, was a desperate man, but she never fathomed the depths to which that desperation would sink. It happened on a Tuesday. The sun was a relentless pale eye in a cloudless sky when Amos Gentry rode into the yard. Amos was a man whose reputation preceded him, a prospector turned rancher, who had buried 2 wives under suspicious circumstances. He was thick-necked, with eyes like chips of dirty flint and a beard stained yellow from tobacco. He didn't come to the door. He stayed by the corral, leading a Holstein cow that looked only slightly better fed than the Higgins' own miserable mules. Jebediah walked out to meet him. Clara watched through the cracked window pane of the kitchen, a cold knot forming in her stomach. She's got good wide hips. Jebediah's voice carried over the dry wind, sharp and unfeeling. Strong back. She's pulled the plow when the mule went lame. Bear you a strong boy, Amos. And she don't talk back. She better not, Amos grunted, running a thick, dirt-encrusted hand over the cow's flank. This here milker is prime. Gives a gallon a day. I'm trading you life, Jebediah. I expect a woman who knows her place in return. Clara couldn't breathe. The realization crashed over her with the violence of a rock slide. She was being sold. Is greater than a daughter's duty is to her family's survival, her father told her moments later. Standing in the kitchen doorway, he wouldn't look her in the eye. Pack your mother's quilt. You leave in 10 minutes. There were no tears. Tears required moisture she didn't possess. Clara packed the faded blue quilt, the only surviving remnant of her mother, Josephine, who had died of winter fever 10 years prior. She owned 1 extra dress, patched at the elbows, and a pair of worn leather boots. When she stepped outside, Amos didn't offer a hand. He pointed to the back of his roan gelding. Get up. We got 20 miles to cover before dusk. The ride into the foothills of the San Juan Mountains was a silent nightmare. Amos reeked of sour sweat and cheap liquor. Every time the horse stumbled, his grip on her thigh tightened, leaving bruised fingerprints into her flesh. As they climbed higher, the dusty plains gave way to looming pine trees and jagged granite cliffs. They made camp near a shallow creek as the light bled from the sky. Amos didn't build a fire. He uncorked a jug of moonshine and drank heavily, his eyes raking over Clara in the twilight. "Come here, girl," he slurred, unbuckling his heavy leather belt. "I have to fetch water," Clara lied, her voice trembling despite her desperate attempt to keep it steady. Amos lunged, moving with a speed that belied his size. His heavy hand cracked across her jaw, sending her sprawling into the dirt. The taste of copper flooded her mouth. "You do what you're told," he hissed, pinning her to the ground, his foul breath hot against her face. In that moment, Clara knew with absolute certainty, if she stayed, she would not survive the week. Survival is often born of sheer, blinding terror. As Amos fumbled with his trousers, the alcohol dulling his coordination, Clara's fingers desperately searched the dirt. They brushed against a heavy river stone. With a guttural cry she didn't know she possessed, she smashed the rock into the side of Amos's head. He roared in pain, his weight shifting just enough. Clara shoved him off, scrambled to her feet, and ran. She didn't look back. She plunged headlong into the pitch-black timberline. The mountain night was a hostile, living thing. Pine branches whipped her face, leaving stinging scratches. Hidden roots grabbed at her ankles. After a mile of frantic, breathless sprinting, her left boot caught in a rabbit hole. She heard the sickening pop before she felt the agony rip through her ankle, sending her tumbling down a steep embankment. She landed in a bed of dry needles, gasping in pain, one boot lost in the brush above. Above her, she could hear Amos bellowing her name, his voice echoing off the canyon walls like a demon's howl. "I paid for you. I'll hunt you down like a dog." Clara dragged herself under the thick, low-hanging branches of a massive blue spruce, curling into a tight ball. She covered her mouth with both hands to stifle the sound of her own ragged breathing. Hours passed. The shouting eventually faded, replaced by the terrifying symphony of the wilderness, the snap of twigs, the distant, mournful howl of a wolf pack, and the sudden, freezing drop in temperature. For 3 days, Clara wandered deeper into the San Juan Range. She was entirely hopelessly lost. She survived by drinking from muddy runoffs and eating bitter pine nuts she dug from the dirt. Her bare foot was a shredded, bloody mess of blisters and cuts. Her ankle had swollen to the size of a melon, forcing her to crawl when the pain became too great to limp. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the sky bruised a deep purple, and the heavens opened up. A torrential, freezing mountain rain began to fall. Hypothermia set in quickly. Clara's teeth chattered violently, her vision blurring at the edges. She dragged herself toward an overhang of rocks, collapsing into the damp dirt beneath it. "So this is it," she thought, her consciousness slipping. "At least I die free. I am not a cow. I am Clara." The darkness was pulling her under. As her eyes fluttered shut, a shadow blocked out the remaining gray light. It wasn't Amos. It was something massive, clad in dripping animal skins, holding a rifle that looked impossibly large. Then, strong, rough hands were lifting her effortlessly from the frozen mud. Clara woke to the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat. She was warm. It was a jarring sensation. She blinked her eyes open, her vision swimming before focusing on thick, rough-hewn log walls. She was lying on a bed of incredibly soft furs, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. Her injured ankle was bound tightly with clean linen, smelling strongly of pungent herbs. Across the small, dimly lit cabin, a man sat by a stone hearth. He was a giant of a man, with shoulders as broad as an ox yoke. A thick, dark beard obscured his jawline, and his hair hung past his collar. He wore soft buckskin trousers and a simple flannel shirt. He was carving a piece of pine with a hunting knife, his movements precise and surprisingly gentle. Clara gasped, pulling the blanket up to her chin, her heart hammering against her ribs. Was this another buyer? Another monster hiding in the hills? The man stopped carving. He didn't stand, didn't move toward her. He simply raised his head. His eyes were a striking, clear gray, like the sky just before the snow falls. There was no malice in them, only a deep, quiet observation. "You're awake." His voice was a deep rumble, rough from disuse, but startlingly soft in volume. "Drink the water beside you." Slowly. Clara looked at the small wooden stool next to the bed. A tin cup sat there. Her thirst overrode her fear. She reached out with a trembling hand, downed the water, and immediately coughed. "Not too fast," the man cautioned. He set his knife down and stood up. Clara shrank back against the logs. He immediately stopped his advance. "I ain't going to hurt you, miss. My name is Gideon. Gideon Cole. Found you near frozen under a ledge by the pass. You've been running from something fierce. The bruising on your jaw tells me it wasn't a bear." Clara touched her face, wincing at the tender spot where Amos had struck her. Am I your prisoner?" she whispered, her voice raspy. Gideon looked genuinely taken aback. A brief flash of sorrow crossed his stoic features. "This is a home, not a cage. The door ain't locked. But if you try walking on that ankle before it sets, you'll cripple yourself for life. You stay until you're healed. Then, You go wherever you please.
This story
Over
was
the next
posted
2
on the
weeks,
channel The Rusty
Clara
Saddle.
learned the quiet
Please do
rhythms
not
of
repost
Gideon
it in any
Cole's
form.
life. He was a trapper and a guide, living miles away from the nearest settlement of Ore. He spoke little, but his actions shouted volumes. He brought her hot broth, made from venison. He changed her bandages with hands that were rough as sandpaper but light as a feather. He never once looked at her with the leering, hungry eyes she was so used to from the men in town. One evening, as the fire crackled, shedding golden light across the cabin, Clara found herself speaking. "He bought me," she said to the flames, "for a Holstein cow." Gideon, who was oiling his rifle, froze. He slowly set the weapon down. "Who did?" "Amos Gentry. My father traded me to him because the crops failed. I hit him with a rock and ran." She expected judgment. She expected him to tell her she was a runaway wife, property that needed returning. Instead, Gideon's jaw clenched. The muscles in his forearms went taut. "Amos Gentry is a dog," Gideon said quietly, his gray eyes flashing with a dangerous, cold fire. "A dog who beats horses and starves his workers. He comes up this mountain, looking for you. He'll find a shallow grave." For the first time in her 19 years, Clara felt a strange, foreign emotion blossom in her chest. It wasn't just safety, it was being valued as a human being. But the mountain gives, and the mountain takes. The next morning, while Clara was resting, Gideon went out to check his trap lines near the lower ridge. He returned hours later, his face grim, carrying a scrap of fabric. It was a piece of Clara's faded blue quilt, torn and muddy. "He didn't give up," Gideon said, barring the heavy oak door of the cabin. "I found his horse tracks. There's 3 men with him. And they are less than 5 miles below the ridge." The heavy oak door of the cabin slid shut with a resounding thud, the thick iron crossbar falling into place like a judge's gavel. Inside, the quiet sanctuary Gideon Cole had built was instantly transformed into a fortress bracing for a siege. Clara watched, her breath catching in her throat, as Gideon moved with a terrifying, calculated efficiency. He pulled a massive, .50 caliber Sharps Buffalo rifle from the mantel, breaking the breech to slide a brass cartridge the size of a man's thumb into the chamber. Next came a pair of Colt Navy revolvers, their cylinders spinning with a deadly click as he checked the loads. "Get away from the windows," Gideon ordered, his voice lacking panic but heavy with authority. He pointed to the cast-iron wood stove in the center of the room. "Crouch behind the iron. It'll stop a bullet better than these pine logs." Clara scrambled behind the stove, the lingering heat radiating against her back. "Who is with him?" she whispered, her hands gripping the edges of her mother's torn blue quilt, which Gideon had retrieved. "Scum," Gideon replied, peering through a narrow chink in the log mortar. "I recognize one of the horses. Belongs to a man named Josiah Rust, a former bounty hunter who got kicked out of Denver for shooting a man in the back. The other looks like Deputy Wallace from the valley, a man who'd sell his own mother for a silver dollar. Amos didn't just bring men, he brought a corrupt badge to make your murder look legal." Outside, the crunch of boots on dry pine needles broke the mountain silence. Then came Amos Gentry's voice, echoing with drunken bravado and vicious malice. "Cole! I know you're in there," Amos bellowed. "I tracked my runaway heifer right to your doorstep. Send the girl out, and we ride away. Keep her. And the deputy here will have you hung for kidnapping and horse thieving." Gideon didn't flinch. He slipped the barrel of the Sharps rifle through a firing port he had carved into the heavy window shutter. "This is sovereign land under the Homestead Act. Gentry," Gideon's voice boomed over the valley, deep and unyielding. "You step 1 foot on my porch, and you'll leave in a pine box." A tense, suffocating silence hung in the air. For a moment, Clara prayed the sheer imposing nature of the mountain man would turn them away. Then, the world exploded. A volley of gunfire erupted from the tree line. Lead tore through the front windows, shattering the glass and showering the cabin floor with glittering shards. The concussive booms of Winchester rifles echoed like thunder inside the small room. Wood splintered, and ceramic bowls on the shelves exploded into dust. Clara screamed, covering her ears as a bullet slammed into the iron stove mere inches from her head, whining as it ricocheted into the ceiling logs. Gideon didn't flinch. He exhaled a slow, steady breath, sighted through the smoke, and squeezed the trigger of the sharps. The massive rifle roared, kicking back against his shoulder. A scream of agony echoed from the trees outside. "That's Russ down," Gideon muttered, swiftly reloading the single-shot rifle. Two left, but Amos Gentry was a coward who fought dirty. Realizing a frontal assault was suicide, he and the corrupt deputy had split up, flanking the cabin. "They're moving to the blind spots," Gideon warned, drawing one of his Colt revolvers. He tossed the second one across the floor. It slid and stopped right at Clara's trembling knees. "Pick it up, Clara." She stared at the heavy iron weapon. I've never shot a gun. You don't have to aim to kill. Just aim to stop them from coming through the door," Gideon said, his gray eyes locking onto hers with intense, grounding focus. "You are not livestock, Clara. You are a survivor. Fight for your life." Before she could process the weight of his words, the sound of splintering wood came from the rear of the cabin. Deputy Wallace had managed to wedge a pickaxe into the back door's hinges. Gideon spun to fire, but a bullet from Amos's rifle ripped through the front shutter, catching Gideon high in the left shoulder. The mountain man grunted, staggering backward as blood instantly bloomed across his buckskin shirt. The Sharp's rifle clattered to the floor. "Gideon!" Clara screamed. At that exact moment, the back door gave way. Deputy Wallace burst through, a maniacal grin on his face, leveling a double-barreled shotgun at Gideon's chest. Instinct, raw and untamed, took over. Clara didn't think. She raised the heavy Colt with both hands, squeezed her eyes shut, and pulled the trigger. The recoil threw her backward, her bad ankle screaming in protest. The deafening crack of the revolver filled the room, immediately followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the floorboards. Clara opened her eyes, gasping for air. Deputy Wallace lay dead in the doorway, his shotgun unfired. Gideon, clutching his bleeding shoulder, looked at the fallen deputy, then back at Clara. A grim, terrifying realization settled over them. They had killed a man wearing a badge, however corrupt he was. "Amos is going to burn us out," Gideon rasped, nodding toward the front window where the unmistakable smell of kerosene and smoke was beginning to drift in. "We can't stay. We have to take the high pass." The back of the cabin was already catching fire, orange flames licking up the dry pine logs. Amos Gentry was screaming curses from the front, tossing another lit kerosene rag onto the roof. Under the floorboards, by the bed, Gideon gritted his teeth, his face pale as he tied a torn strip of his shirt tightly around his shoulder. "There's a root cellar. It connects to an old drainage pipe that empties into the ravine behind the property." Clara scrambled to the bed, ignoring the throbbing pain in her ankle. She hauled up the heavy wooden trapdoor. A damp, dark earthen tunnel lay below. "Go," Gideon ordered, shoving a canvas sack filled with dried meat, a canteen, and extra ammunition into her hands. "Don't stop until you hit the ravine." They dropped into the cellar just as the cabin's roof began to cave in, a shower of sparks illuminating the dark. They crawled through the narrow, suffocating dirt pipe, the smell of wet earth and copper blood heavy in the enclosed space. When they finally tumbled out into the rocky ravine, the night air was freezing. The sky had turned a bruised, menacing gray. The temperature was plummeting rapidly. The legendary, brutal winter of the San Juan Mountains was arriving early. Gideon was leaning heavily against a boulder, his breathing shallow. The bullet had passed clean through his shoulder, but he was losing blood fast. "We need to make for the old Silver Queen mine," he panted, pointing up the jagged, treacherous slope of the mountain. "It's 2 miles up. Amos won't track us in the dark, especially when the snow starts." And start it did. Within 20 minutes, a blinding, furious blizzard descended upon them. The wind howled like a wounded animal, driving sharp shards of ice into their faces.
This story was posted
Clara
on the
took
channel The
lead.
Rusty Saddle.
The girl who had
Please
been
do not
traded for a
repost
cow
it in any
days
form.
earlier was now the lifeline for a giant mountain man. She slung Gideon's good arm over her shoulder, bearing a terrifying amount of his weight. Every step up the rocky incline was agony for her injured ankle, but she bit through her lip until it bled to keep from crying out. "Leave me, Clara," Gideon murmured, his chin resting against her head as they stumbled through knee-deep drifts. "I'm slowing you down. He wants you, not me. You can make it to Telluride if you follow the ridgeline." "Shut up, Gideon Cole," Clara hissed, her voice fierce, fueled by a stubborn fire she never knew she possessed. "You pulled me out of the mud. I am not leaving you in the snow. Now move your feet." They reached the gaping black maw of the Silver Queen mine just as Gideon's legs gave out completely. He collapsed onto the dusty, rock-strewn floor of the cavern. Clara dragged him deeper inside, away from the howling wind, into the total darkness of the abandoned shaft. She fumbled in the canvas sack, her half-frozen fingers finding a box of matches and a small tin of lamp oil Gideon had packed. She managed to light a small fire, using broken timber from an old mine cart. The flickering orange light revealed a grim picture. Gideon was deathly pale, his gray eyes glassy and unfocused. Clara ripped the hem of her dress, boiled water in a small tin cup over the fire, and meticulously cleaned the gunshot wound. She packed it with the last of the medicinal herbs he had used on her ankle, binding it tight. For 2 days and 2 nights, the blizzard raged outside. They were entombed in the Silver Queen. During the darkest hours, when the cold threatened to snuff out their lives, they huddled together for warmth beneath the heavy furs Gideon had managed to carry out. "Why did you come to the mountains?" Clara asked him on the second night, her head resting against his uninjured chest, listening to the steady, comforting thrum of his heartbeat. Gideon was silent for a long time. "I had a wife once," he said, his voice a low, painful rumble in the dark, "and a little girl, down in Kansas. Cholera took them both in the summer of '68. I buried my heart in the prairie dirt. Came up here because the mountains don't ask you to feel anything. They just ask you to survive." He shifted, his rough hand gently lifting her chin so she had to look into his eyes, illuminated by the dying embers. "I didn't want to feel anything ever again, Clara," Gideon whispered, brushing a stray lock of dirt-streaked hair from her face. "But when I saw you under that ledge, fighting so hard just to take one more breath, you woke something up in me. You brought the ghost back to life." Tears, hot and fast, spilled down Clara's cheeks. Amos Gentry had looked at her and seen a transaction. Her father had looked at her and seen a burden. But Gideon Cole looked at her and saw a warrior. He saw a woman. "I won't let him take you back," Gideon vowed, his grip tightening protectively around her. "I swear it on my life." Clara pressed her forehead against his, a profound, unshakable bond forging between them in the dark of the earth. "He won't take either of us," she replied softly. But as dawn broke on the third day, the howling wind outside finally ceased, replaced by a terrifying, crisp silence. And then, echoing off the cavern walls, came the unmistakable sound of a rifle being cocked. Amos Gentry had found them. The metallic clack-clack of a Winchester lever-action rifle chambering a round was a sound Clara would never forget. It sliced through the oppressive, dripping silence of the Silver Queen mine, echoing off the damp, jagged walls and magnifying the threat, until it felt as though an entire army of ghosts had come to collect them. "I smell smoke, Amos, and copper, fresh blood." The voice that slithered down the main tunnel didn't belong to the dead deputy or the bounty hunter left in the snow. It belonged to Hiram Potts. Hiram was a notoriously vicious tracker out of Durango, a man who had made a lucrative living hunting down runaway indebted miners for the Smuggler Union Mining Company. Worse still, before he carried a badge for the syndicate, Hiram had swung a pickaxe in these very drifts during the boom of '68. He knew the subterranean labyrinth of the Silver Queen better than the men who had blasted it. "Bring the lantern up, Hiram," Amos Gentry's voice rumbled. It was thick with venomous anticipation, echoing with the drunken bravado of a man who believed he had already won. "And keep your iron drawn. That mountain savage already took out Wallace and Rust. He's bleeding out, but he ain't dead yet. I want the girl intact. The man, you can shoot to pieces." Inside the pitch-black depths of their hidden alcove, Clara's breath caught in her throat. She pressed her cold, trembling hand over Gideon's mouth, feeling the hot, ragged exhalations of his fever against her palm. He was too weak to fight a hand-to-hand battle. His broad chest was rising and falling with shallow, painful gasps. The heavy-caliber bullet that had passed through his shoulder had sapped the colossal strength that usually made him an immovable force of nature. "You have to be the mountain now, Clara," Gideon breathed into her ear. His large, calloused hand gripped her wrist with the absolute last ounce of his fading strength. Even in the dark, his presence was a heavy, grounding anchor. "The Silver Queen is a maze, but Hiram knows it. He'll track my blood trail straight to this corner." "I am not leaving your side," Clara whispered fiercely, her fingers tightening around the cold, heavy iron of the Colt Navy revolver he had given her. "You ain't leaving me." "You're saving us," Gideon replied, his voice a gravelly, desperate rasp. Just past the rusted ore carts in the main drift, the floor gives way. They used to call it the Devil's Drop. It's a 300-foot ventilation shaft straight down to the lower water levels. "Draw them left, toward the drop. I'll take the right tunnel and flank them. Do it, Clara. Now." With a heart hammering so violently she feared Amos could hear it echoing off the stone, Clara slipped away from the meager warmth of Gideon's side. She crept along the tunnel wall, her bare, battered foot and tightly bandaged ankle protesting every silent, agonizing step on the loose shale. Ahead, the weak, sickly yellow glow of Hiram's kerosene lantern began to paint dancing, monstrous shadows on the cavern walls. The smell of burning oil mixed nauseatingly with the ancient, stale scent of sulfur and rot. She needed a distraction. If they followed her directly, they would realize Gideon wasn't with her. Her hands, blindly searching the dark, brushed against the rusted iron rim of an abandoned mining cart. It was sitting on a slight incline on a set of decaying, warped iron tracks. It was filled to the brim with discarded, heavy granite tailings. "Forgive me, Ma," she thought. Slipping the heavy Colt into the deep pocket of her torn apron, she planted her good foot against a wooden support beam, pressed her shoulders against the back of the iron cart, and pushed with every fiber of her being. At first, the cart merely groaned, its rusted wheels fused to the track by a decade of dampness. Clara gritted her teeth, tasting copper as she bit down on her lip, and threw her entire body weight forward. With a deafening, ungodly screech of metal tearing against metal, the rust gave way. The heavy cart surged forward, plunging down the left-hand tunnel directly toward the advancing yellow light. "Watch out!" Hiram screamed, his voice pitching high with sudden panic. The lantern shattered against the stone wall as the tracker frantically dove out of the way of the runaway cart. The cavern was instantly plunged back into total, suffocating darkness, save for the bright orange sparks flying from the cart's iron wheels as they ground against the tracks. In the pure chaos of the moment, Clara drew the heavy Colt, raised it with both hands, and fired blindly into the dark where Amos's voice had been. The muzzle flash illuminated the terror for a fraction of a second, casting harsh, strobe-like shadows over Hiram's sprawling body and Amos's shocked face. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space, a physical blow to the eardrums. "You little prairie bitch!" Amos roared in the dark. He fired back wildly. A bullet splintered the wooden support beam mere inches from Clara's head, showering her face and shoulders in ancient dust and razor-sharp wood splinters. "She's over here! By the tracks!" Hiram yelled, scrambling in the pitch black, his boots crunching loudly over the loose shale. But Clara was already moving, using the ringing echo of the gunfire to mask the heavy, uneven drag of her limp. She retreated deeper into the left tunnel, exactly as Gideon had instructed. She could hear the heavy,
This story was
frantic
posted
boots
on the
of
channel
Amos
The
and
Rusty
Hiram
Saddle.
stumbling
Please
over
do
the
not
rocks
repost
behind
it in
her,
any form.
their curses echoing in the black. Then, Amos's voice echoed through the dark. It didn't sound angry anymore. It dripped with a cruel, mocking laugh that sent a chill deeper into Clara's bones than the mountain blizzard ever could. "You think you're fighting for your freedom, Clara? You think you're some wild mountain heroine?" Amos taunted, his voice bouncing off the damp stone, seemingly coming from everywhere at once. "You think your daddy wept when you rode off? You think Jebediah Higgins gave you up just because the rain didn't fall?" Clara stopped. The darkness pressed in on her. She held her breath, her back pressed flat against the freezing, wet rock of the tunnel wall. "Jebediah didn't sell you for a Holstein cow because of a drought." Amos's voice slithered closer. The strike of a match illuminated his face 20 yards away. He was holding the small flame up, searching the shadows, his eyes wide and manic. "Your daddy owed me $300 in faro debts from the Red Dog Saloon in Olathe. $300 he pissed away while you were pulling his plow like a mule. I poisoned his well to kill his last crop so he'd have no choice but to hand you over to settle the ledger. You were never a daughter, Clara. You were nothing but a poker chip to him." The words hit Clara harder than the river stone she had used to smash Amos's face days ago. The betrayal sliced through her, raw, absolute, and utterly devastating. Her entire life of suffering, her mother's slow death, the relentless, gnawing hunger, the calluses that bled on her hands, it wasn't bad luck. It wasn't the wrath of God or a failing frontier. It was a game rigged by the very man who was supposed to protect her. For a fraction of a second, the revelation threatened to break her. But then, a cold, hardened fury replaced the terror in her veins. The girl who had cowered in the Higgins farmhouse died in that mine shaft. She stepped away from the wall. She stood exactly at the edge of the abyss Gideon had warned her about. The air here was distinctly different, stale, drafty, pulling downward into the massive, 300-foot drop of the Devil's Drop. She kicked a loose piece of gravel. It fell into the blackness for a terrifyingly long time before a faint, distant plink echoed from the bottom of the world. "I'm right here, Amos," Clara called out. Her voice was eerily calm, devoid of the trembling, frightened girl she had been. It was the voice of the mountain. Footsteps crunched rapidly. Hiram Potts struck another match, the sulfur flaring brightly. The tracker held the small flame high, revealing Amos Gentry standing barely 10 feet away. Amos had his Winchester raised to his shoulder, a victorious, ugly, tobacco-stained sneer plastered across his face. "End of the line, heifer," Amos spat, his finger tightening on the trigger. Before Amos could apply the final pound of pressure to the trigger, a massive, terrifying shadow detached itself from the rocks directly behind Hiram. Gideon Cole, bleeding, pale as a ghost, but fueled by a terrifying, primal rage, swung the heavy wooden handle of a discarded miner's pickaxe. He didn't have the strength to swing the iron head, but the thick hickory handle connected with the back of Hiram's skull with a sickening, wet crack. The tracker dropped instantly like a stone, the match extinguishing as it hit the wet cavern floor. The mine was plunged back into darkness, save for the pale, ghostly moonlight filtering down through the distant ventilation shaft high above the Devil's Drop. Amos spun around in sheer panic, firing his rifle from the hip. The blinding muzzle flash illuminated the cavern. The heavy bullet grazed Gideon's ribcage, tearing through his buckskin shirt and carving a bloody furrow across his side. Gideon let out a deep, guttural grunt, his knees finally buckling under the immense trauma his body had endured. He collapsed to the rocky floor. Amos quickly racked the lever, the brass casing ejecting into the air, and aimed the hot barrel directly down at Gideon's head. "Should have stayed dead in Kansas, mountain man." "No!" Clara screamed. She didn't raise her gun. She didn't have the time to aim. She lunged forward with everything she had, throwing her entire body weight into Amos's midsection just as the rifle fired. The shot went wild, the bullet ricocheting off the ceiling and bringing down a shower of loose shale. The kinetic impact of Clara's tackle sent both her and Amos tumbling backward, sliding violently across the loose gravel toward the lip of the gaping black shaft. Amos dropped his rifle, his thick, dirty hands scrambling desperately for purchase on the slick, wet stone. Finding nothing but loose dirt, he blindly grabbed the thick canvas fabric of Clara's heavy work dress, hauling her over the edge with him. Clara's hands slammed onto the rocky lip of the precipice, tearing the skin from her palms. Her legs dangled out over the 300-foot void, the freezing draft from below whipping at her boots. Amos was hanging entirely from her skirt, his massive, dead weight tearing the ancient, patched fabric. He was swinging wildly over the abyss. "Pull me up," Amos shrieked. His bravado had vanished entirely, instantly replaced by the pathetic, sniveling terror of a coward facing the absolute dark. "Pull me up, you stupid girl. I'll let you go. I swear to God." Clara looked down at the man dangling beneath her. She looked at the monster who had bought her like livestock, the man who had ruined her family, the man who had just shot the only person in the world who had ever truly seen her as a human being. Her arms were screaming in absolute agony, the muscles in her shoulders threatening to pop out of their sockets under his immense weight. She looked up. Gideon was dragging himself across the gravel toward her, leaving a thick smear of blood in his wake. His hand was outstretched, his clear gray eyes locked onto hers with a desperate, naked panic. Clara looked back down into the whites of Amos Gentry's terrified eyes. The torn fabric of her dress was rapidly unraveling, the sound of tearing canvas echoing loudly over the drop. "I am not a cow, Amos," Clara whispered. Her voice was steady, carrying clearly over the abyss. "And I am not your property." With a swift, deliberate, and final motion, she shifted her weight. She let go of the ledge with her right hand and reached down to her waist. She unbuckled the heavy leather belt of her work apron, the only thing keeping the heavy, tearing skirt attached to her waist. The thick brass buckle clicked open. The fabric tore completely free. Amos Gentry's scream was a horrifying, ragged sound that echoed all the way down into the belly of the Silver Queen. It faded into the dark for what felt like an eternity, finally ending with a sickening, distant, and muffled thud that shook the dust from the walls. A heavy, absolute silence rushed back into the mine. Gideon's massive hand clamped around Clara's wrist with iron strength. With a roar of exertion, he hauled her up over the jagged ledge, pulling her tightly against his bleeding chest. They collapsed together onto the cold, wet stone floor, trembling violently, gasping for the stale cavern air, completely enveloped in the heavy, silent dust of the mountain's brutal justice. The dawn broke over the San Juan Mountains not with warmth, but with a blinding, diamond-hard light that reflected off 3 feet of fresh snow. Clara and Gideon emerged from the jagged mouth of the Silver Queen mine, 2 ghosts stepping out of the underworld. They were battered, caked in a thick crust of gray stone dust and dried blood, their breath pluming in the freezing morning air. Gideon leaned heavily against Clara, his massive frame shivering as the adrenaline that had kept him fighting finally bled away. "We can't stop, Gideon," Clara whispered, adjusting her grip around his waist. The cold was a physical weight pressing against them. "If we sit, we freeze. You told me that." The descent from the mountain was a grueling, agonizing testament to human endurance. What should have been a half-day's hike took them nearly 48 hours. They moved in spurts, surviving on handfuls of melted snow and the sheer, stubborn refusal to die. Gideon's shoulder wound was weeping, a terrifying yellowish fluid, and a fever had taken root, burning his skin hot against the freezing mountain air. Clara, wearing a dress missing its lower half and a boot hastily bound with torn fabric, became the leader. She navigated the treacherous, snow-blind passes, hauling a man twice her size over fallen timber and ice-slicked shale. Every step was a battle against her own screaming ankle and the crippling exhaustion threatening to pull her into the snowdrifts. On the afternoon of the second day, the timberline
This story
broke,
was posted on the
revealing
channel The
sprawling,
Rusty
smoky
Saddle.
valley
Please
of
do not
Telluride
repost
below.
it in any form.
It was a bustling, chaotic silver boom town teeming with miners, prospectors, and outlaws. When they stumbled onto the muddy main street, the town ground to a halt. Saloon doors stopped swinging. Wagons pulled to the side. They were a terrifying sight. A giant mountain man bordering on unconsciousness, supported by a fierce, wild-eyed girl covered in soot and blood, clutching a heavy Colt revolver in her free hand. "Help him!" Clara screamed, her voice cracking, echoing off the wooden storefronts. "I need a doctor." Dr. Harrison Miller, a veteran of the Civil War with a pragmatic bedside manner, rushed from his apothecary. He and two burly miners hauled Gideon onto a canvas stretcher, carrying him into the clinic. The next 3 days were a blur of carbolic acid, boiling water, and terror. Gideon's infection was deep. Dr. Miller wanted to amputate the arm, claiming the sepsis would reach his heart by morning. "You will not cut off his arm," Clara declared, standing between the doctor's bone saw and Gideon's unconscious form. She hadn't slept in 4 days. Her eyes were sunken, but the heavy Colt was resting purposefully on her lap. "Miss Higgins, I am trying to save his life," Dr. Miller sighed, wiping sweat from his brow. "He's a trapper, a mountain man. He needs both arms to survive," Clara said, her voice shaking but resolute. "Clean the wound again. I know a poultice from the Ute women who traded near Olathe. Yarrow and pine pitch. Send a boy to fetch it. Now." Whether out of respect for her sheer willpower or fear of the revolver, the doctor complied. Clara stayed by Gideon's side every second, packing the wound with the pungent, burning poultice, bathing his fevered brow, and whispering stories of the high valleys into his ear. On the morning of the 4th day, the fever broke. Gideon opened his clear gray eyes, finding Clara asleep, her head resting on his chest. But their survival was only the beginning of a new nightmare. Just as Gideon began to regain his strength, the heavy boots of the law marched into the clinic. Sheriff Wyatt Sterling was a man who didn't care for mountain justice. He cared for ledgers and the law of the Smuggler Union Mining Company. "Gideon Cole." "Clara Higgins," Sheriff Sterling announced, removing his Stetson. He was accompanied by 2 deputies holding repeating rifles. "You're both under arrest for the murder of Deputy Wallace, Josiah Rust, and Amos Gentry." Clara's heart plummeted into her stomach. It was self-defense. "They hunted us." Sheriff Sterling pulled a notebook from his breast pocket. "That ain't the story I got. A man stumbled into town yesterday morning. Hiram Potts. Got a fractured skull, but he can talk fine. He says you two ambushed Amos's posse to steal a lockbox of gold Amos was carrying to settle a land dispute. Says you threw Amos down the Silver Queen shaft when he wouldn't give up the combination." Gideon, still pale but possessing a terrifying, quiet anger. "Maybe," Sterling countered coldly, "but he's a living witness, and Amos was a wealthy man with friends in the mining syndicate. Without proof, you're both facing the hangman's noose." Clara was locked in a small, damp holding cell adjoining the sheriff's office, separated from Gideon for the first time since the cabin. The walls felt like a cage closing in. She had escaped the auction block, fought off a mutter, survived a blizzard, and dragged the man she loved down a mountain, only to be killed by a corrupt lawman's pen. She paced the cell, her mind racing back through the pitch-black tunnels of the Silver Queen. Hiram hadn't seen Amos fall. Gideon had struck Hiram down before Amos fired the final shot. Hiram was constructing a lie to claim Amos's wealth for himself or the mining company, using their survival as a scapegoat. "Sheriff Sterling," Clara called through the iron bars later that evening, "bring Hiram Potts here. Let me look him in the eye." The next morning, the confrontation took place in the sheriff's office. Hiram Potts, his head wrapped in thick bandages, sat smirking across the heavy oak desk. Gideon, heavily guarded and chained to a chair, watched Hiram with the intensity of a caged wolf. "She's a black widow, Sheriff," Hiram sneered, pointing a trembling finger at Clara. "She lured Amos into the dark, and that giant bashed his brains in." Clara didn't flinch. She leaned forward, placing her hands flat on the sheriff's desk. "Hiram," Clara said, her voice dropping into a deadly, calm register. "If we robbed Amos of a gold lockbox, where is it?" "You hid it in the mine," Hiram spat. "If we hid it in the mine, why did we leave you alive?" Clara countered smoothly. "Gideon had a pickaxe. If we were murderers, we would have finished the job. But we didn't. We ran." She turned her gaze to Sheriff Sterling. "Sheriff, send your deputies up to the Silver Queen. Tell them to rappel down the main excavation shaft, the 300-foot drop just past the rusted ore carts." Hiram's smirk faltered. A bead of sweat rolled down his pale cheek. Clara laid out the truth like a hand of winning cards. Asterisk. "You will find Amos Gentry's body at the bottom. Asterisk. You will not find a lockbox, because there never was one. But you will find my leather apron belt, still clutched in his dead hands. Asterisk. Amos bragged to us before he died that he poisoned my father's well in Olathe to force him into a debt. Check the deeds in Olathe. You'll find Amos was foreclosing on farms, not settling disputes." "She's lying," Hiram shouted, trying to stand. But a deputy forced him back down. "Hiram," Clara said softly, delivering the final blow. "When Gideon hit you, the lantern shattered. It was pitch black. How could you possibly know how Amos died if you were unconscious on the floor?" The room fell dead silent. Sheriff Sterling looked at Hiram's panicked, sweating face, then back to the fiercely intelligent young woman standing before him. The tracker's lie was unraveling under the weight of Clara's unyielding reality. "Deputy," Sterling barked, not taking his eyes off Hiram, "get a climbing crew. Head up to the Silver Queen. If you find a leather belt in Amos Gentry's hands, put Hiram Potts in irons for perjury and conspiracy." It took 3 days for the deputies to return. They brought with them the broken, frozen body of Amos Gentry. Clutched in his stiff fingers was the heavy leather belt Clara had sacrificed to send him into the dark. The charges were dropped immediately. Hiram Potts was thrown into the territorial prison, and the corrupt shadow of Amos Gentry was finally, permanently extinguished. When Clara and Gideon walked out of the sheriff's office, the air felt different. It wasn't just cold, it felt clean. Using the gold coins Gideon had safely stashed in the Telluride Bank from his years of trapping, they didn't return to the harsh, isolated ridges of Black Bear Pass. They bought a sprawling, beautiful plot of land in the Uncompahgre Valley, where the soil was rich, the river ran clear, and the mountains stood as protectors rather than captors. Over the next year, they built a life from the ground up. Gideon constructed a large, sturdy cabin with wide glass windows that faced the sunrise. He refused to put a heavy iron crossbar on the front door. Clara never returned to Olathe. She never sent word to Jebediah Higgins. The girl who had been traded for a Holstein cow no longer existed. In her place stood a woman of the frontier, a survivor who had fought for her life and won. She became known throughout the valley as a skilled healer, using the knowledge she had gained, saving Gideon to help the local homesteaders. One evening in late autumn, the sky painted in bruised purples and brilliant oranges, Clara sat on the porch of their new home. She had the faded blue quilt wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Gideon walked up the wooden steps, the setting sun catching the silver that was beginning to streak his dark beard. His shoulder had healed with a thick, jagged scar, a permanent reminder of the price they had paid for this peace. He sat beside her, handing her a small object he had been whittling for weeks. Clara took it carefully. It was a magnificent, meticulously detailed carving of a mountain bluebird, its wings spread wide, caught in a permanent state of flight. "No cages," Gideon murmured, his deep voice carrying over the rustling aspen trees. His gray eyes were soft, completely stripped of the cold, defensive armor he used to wear. He looked at her not as a possession, not as a debt settled, but as his equal, his partner, and his savior. "No cages," Clara agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder. She looked out over the valley they owned, the life they had fought for. The West was a brutal, unforgiving place that ground the weak into dust. But it had made a fatal mistake with Clara. It had tried to sell her, and instead, it had forged her into iron. She laced her fingers through Gideon's, knowing that whatever winters came next, they would face the storms together, free, fierce, and unbroken. Clara and Gideon Cole's story became a quiet legend whispered among the homesteaders of the San Juan Valley. Their life together wasn't built on the transactional cruelties of the era, but on a foundation
This story was
of
posted on the
profound
channel
mutual
The Rusty
respect and
Saddle.
survival,
Please do not
forged
repost
in
it
the
in any
unforgiving
form.
Rockies. They raised 3 children who were taught to read the weather, track the game, and, above all, value their own unyielding independence. Clara never forgot the price of her freedom, transforming her trauma into strength, becoming a well-respected healer in the territory who offered safe harbor to other women fleeing brutality. The cow she was traded for was eventually slaughtered, and Amos Gentry became nothing but dust at the bottom of a forgotten shaft. But Clara Higgins, the girl who refused to be property, built a legacy of love and defiance that outlasted the very silver mines that almost claimed her life.